chose to focus on for this project is the disparities in quality of education and access to educational opportunities throughout the United States. We picked educational inequality because it is a deeply rooted issue that has both short-term and long-term harms. Lack of access to various education resources impacts students' abilities to think independently and critically and engage in social interaction, which can influence their academic achievements and future economic stability. We recognize that the classroom is not the only place that kids learn or are harmed by these inequalities, but for our project, we have chosen to focus on harms that exist in school settings like the classroom and extracurricular environments.
First, we are going to look at the specific harms of educational inequalities in the U.S., how to analyze them, and who they affect most.
While there are many individuals harmed by issues relating to education inequality, our research showed that youths from low socioeconomic status and students of color are some of the most harmed by these disparities in the U.S. There is intersectionality in this issue as well, meaning there can be overlap between these students facing these issues. Although we are looking at some of the structural aspects of education inequality, each individual student is impacted differently.
We acknowledge that everyone's definition of quality education is different, and students often need different resources to succeed. To better understand what quality education might mean to each individual, we use Nussbaum's capabilities approach as a framework. Martha Nussbaum, an influential philosopher and feminist, uses a capabilities approach to help us understand what people are actually capable of doing or becoming in the real world. She outlines 10 central capabilities that she deems essential for individuals to live a dignified life. They include life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination, and thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, and control over one's political and material environment. This framework is helpful to understand how differences in quality of education and access to opportunities affects individuals' learning development and their future success.
When looking at the harms of educational inequality from the capabilities approach, we concluded that the capabilities most threatened by gaps in equality are affiliation, sense, imagination, and thought, and practical reason. Each of these capabilities are directly impacted by the harmful short-term and long-term effects of educational disparities and help us understand how low-income and minority students are affected.
The capability affiliation mainly refers to one's ability to engage in social interaction. Many low-income and minority students experience a lack of social interaction due to their lack of participation in extracurricular activities, mainly due to financial constraints, and their lack of participation in classroom settings, respectively. Studies have shown that underrepresented ethnic minority students and first-generation students report a lower sense of belonging than continuing generation students or white students. This experience of low psychological safety in the classroom is harmful because it causes these students to refrain from participating and expressing their thoughts and can be directly tied to lower rates of personal and academic success. This leads to less diversity of ideas in the classroom and prevents these students from advocating for themselves, defending their ideas, and having the confidence and communication skills that are useful in networking and building a career. Additionally, students who lack the financial resources to pay for extracurricular activities outside of the classroom likely engage in less social interaction with kids their age and may miss out on relationship building with peers and influential adult mentors. A lack or limitation of sense, imagination, and thought can be harmful because students may not be able to produce their own expressive work or share their perspective or experience through critical thinking. Additionally, these students harmed may struggle to imagine themselves in a power role due to a lack of representation. This in turn can decrease their drive or ambition to actually achieve this high-powered role because they can't imagine themselves in that position or consider it to be an option for them. In an article titled "Books I Wish My White Teachers Had Read," author Crystal Paul explains that she can only remember having 2 non-white teachers during her time at school. While she acknowledges that some of her white teachers had a positive impact on her, many others did not. She was given a failing grade in art by her white teacher, who explained to her that graffiti isn't art, and she was kicked out of class when she tried to explain to her math teacher that she already understood the work he was so condescendingly explaining to her. These experiences that Crystal shared in her article contextualize how some minority students are prevented from producing their own creative work and thinking differently than what is taught to them.
The harms of a lack of practical reason may be that students are unable to engage in critical reflection by challenging the opinions of others or developing their own opinions about politics, religion, or culture. These educational years are important for cognitive development and social skills, so if students don't have the capability to practically reason, they may struggle later on in life when independently navigating college, a career, or personal life. In Charlize Lyle's memoir, Do I Dare Disturb the Universe, she talks about her experiences growing up in Cleveland public schools compared to the private, predominantly white school nearby. She explains how the difference in testing in her school's lack of blue books represents a way larger issue about the differences in education. The public school she went to only had multiple choice questions on their tests, while the private school had long essay questions that they wrote in blue books. This shows how Charlize's capability of critical thinking and formation of ideas was harmed due to her school's lack of resources. As of 2013, the rich-poor gap in test scores was about 40% larger now than it was 30 years ago. While test scores do not necessarily equate to success, they can be revealing in demonstrating differences in school-level achievement and cognitive development, as well as practical reason.
Because the capabilities we mentioned are harmed earlier in life, it can be harder for the impacted students to develop some of the many hard and soft skills that are often valued in the workplace. This can lead to future harms such as economic hardship and the lack of opportunity to be hired for higher-paying jobs. Another less talked about harm comes from young's faces of oppression. The concept of powerlessness ties into class perceptions and harmful prejudices with the lack of quote-unquote professional jobs. The concept of powerlessness includes the lack of autonomy at work and perceived status or self-worth that may align with having a professional job. This is harmful because lower perceived status can impact mental health, drive, and self-worth.
Some people inherently benefit from education inequality and can be referred to as the privileged group in this scenario. For example, students who live in wealthier neighborhoods have resources both from their parents' independent spending as well as government allocated resources that allow them to gain more critical thinking skills and social development. In addition, students who are part of the majority race or ethnicity in their environment most likely feel a greater sense of belonging and will face less discrimination than other students in the classroom. This may lead to higher achievement in school, more future economic opportunity, higher self-worth, and the attainment of professional jobs, according to Young's interpretation.
Now we are going to discuss the structural aspects of the harms faced by the groups mentioned earlier, low-income students and students of color.
Many people take an individualistic approach to understanding the gaps in educational achievement and the way one's achievement in school affects them later in life. Some people attribute bad grades and lack of participation in extracurricular activities with the assumption that an individual is lazy or not smart. This individualistic approach can be also seen through the college admissions and the idea that more extracurriculars and a more rigorous course load may increase a student's chance of getting into a school because they make a student more well-rounded. Students or job applicants may be perceived as unqualified for jobs or college through an individualistic lens. However, when you consider the structures at play that constrain certain individuals, there is much more behind the lack of extracurriculars, low GPA, or years of formal schooling that an applicant has. It is important to acknowledge that these systems and institutions that constrain and enable certain actions exist. Social structures are durable, persist over time, and cross from one individual to another. The social structures we are going to explore shape the opportunities, or lack thereof, available to students due to their identity. When looking at structural causes of education inequality, we found that written policies and guidelines, as well as relationship structures and stereotypes, cause the most harm to the low-income and minority students. While we acknowledge that there are many structures that harm kids before they even enter the school system, we want to focus on the structural harms that exist during students' fundamental school years, both inside the classroom walls and in other environments.
Many lower-income and minority families live in neighborhoods with schools that are severely underfunded by the government. Since much of school funding can come from individual property taxes, if there is a concentration of low-income families in one school zone, these schools will receive less funding. This means less resources and extracurricular opportunities available to kids living in these areas. As you can see from the graph above, there are major differences in the amount of money spent per student on public education in the United States, depending on the state. What is often less discussed, however, are the differences in spending and funding per student even within the same school districts. According to Linda Darling Hammond at the Stanford University School of Education, not only do funding systems allocate fewer resources to poor urban districts than to their suburban neighbors, but studies consistently show that within these school districts, schools with higher concentrations of low-income and minority students receive fewer instructional resources than others in the same district. For example, schools with 90% or more students of color spend $733 less per student per year than schools with 90% or more white students, according to a study. Since these low-income and minority-inhabited areas receive less funding, wealthier white families are more likely to label or perceive these areas and schools as dangerous or less than ideal areas. Wealthier families have more options when considering where to live and where to send their children to school. On the other hand, lower-income families have financial constraints that prevent them from having the same amount of choice.
These graphs from the Census Bureau represent how participation in lessons in sports varies based on whether or not children and their families are in poverty. Those who are below the poverty level all months of the year participate the least in these extracurricular activities, less than families who are below the poverty line only for a few months or not at all. 24.6 million children in the U.S. are unable to access an after-school program, and many report cost as a barrier. In addition to financial constraints, many low-income students often have additional responsibilities outside of school, such as taking care of younger siblings, grandparents, or getting a part-time job. Transportation to and from these activities can also be a barrier. The fact that wealthier families are spending more on enrichment activities for their children only exacerbates this gap for low-income families. Economists Richard Mernan and Greg Duncan report that from 1972 to 2006, high-income families increased the amount they spent on enrichment programs for their children by 150%, while the spending of low-income families grew only by 57% over the same period. Relationship development is a crucial aspect of students' development as they progress through school. Students and teachers have an inherent relationship that can enable or constrain each student's ability to succeed in the classroom. The majority of teachers in the school system are white and may relate more closely to students who look like them. Additionally, teachers' biases may cause them to give different treatment to different students. The existing power dynamic between teachers and students can be exacerbated when they come from different backgrounds. Additionally, when there is preferential treatment in the classroom, that may create a hierarchy between students from different backgrounds, further perpetuating the advantages and disadvantages that result from these social structures. Christina Torres, pictured here with one of her students, is a teacher for the nonprofit Teach for America who identifies as Latina. She discusses her experience as a student at a majority white school with teachers who didn't understand her background. She says, "It's not just I who needed a teacher of color, my white classmates also needed one. They needed a teacher of color to see that those stereotypes aren't true. I think it would have had a big effect on the way I saw myself and the way other kids saw me too, if I had had a teacher who looked like me."
One of the main structural practices that explains why relationships in schools can become unbalanced is the existence of stereotypes and discrimination. The lack of recognition of diverse cultural modes of expression and ways of life can affect students' abilities to succeed in school. For example, the speech culture of women, ethnic minorities, and working-class people may differ, be more expressive, more figurative, and more exuberant. For example, Bell Hooks reflects on her own experiences of higher education as a Black working-class woman at Stanford University, saying, "Loudness, anger, emotional outbursts, and even something as seemingly innocent as unrestrained laughter were deemed as unacceptable, vulgar disruptions of classroom social order."
While bell hooks only represents one voice of the many individuals affected by stereotyping and discrimination, this displays that there are certain social norms, many of which are unwritten, that dictate what is appropriate behavior or expression.
After examining the harms and structures that surround education inequalities in the U.S., we wanted to look into a few recommendations that may help mitigate educational inequality in the U.S. and conduct an ethical analysis of these potential solutions. First, we'll look at the issues that currently harm students, then discuss what can be done. Finally, we want to make sure these solutions are practically effective, politically feasible, and morally permissible.
One issue we have studied has been the lack of diverse and representative faculty in public schools across the U.S. This is damaging because it is proven that students perform better when they have mentors and teachers who look like them. Although more teachers of color are being recruited across the nation, the pace of increase is slow, and quitting rates are high, leaving gaps between the supply and demand for such teachers. Another current harmful structural issue we are addressing is income inequality. While income inequality itself is not necessarily an unjust disadvantage, the social and legal structures that perpetuate this disadvantage can be unjust. For example, as we discussed in Project 2, many lower income and minority families live in neighborhoods with schools that are severely underfunded by the government. While it seems reasonable to say that low-income families may be more restricted in their spending, it does not seem reasonable or just for their school systems to be underfunded. In addition, many public schools in the U.S. get a lot of their local funding from property taxes. But in low-income areas where property value is low, these schools do not get enough funding from these taxes. There are many theories and opinions on what should be done to solve these issues, but we know that no one can tackle every problem. We are focusing on solutions that we believe to be the most effective in addressing these serious issues. Our overall belief is that if you can do something to improve the current situation, then you should, as long as no one is being harmed further in the process.
Our recommendations are guided by the principle that we should strive for equality of opportunity. This doesn't necessarily mean equality of outcome because we can't guarantee outcome, but it gives those individuals affected by these harms an equitable chance to succeed. Our first recommendation seeks to address the fact that most teachers in the education system are white, and therefore children of color don't have the same experience of learning from a mentor that looks like them. This graph shows the U.S. population of students by race in 2017 compared to their teachers. As you can see, there are way more white teachers per white student than there are Hispanic or Black teachers per Hispanic or Black student. As we mentioned earlier, there are clear psychological benefits for students of color to have teachers that look like them and share various cultural values. In addition, research has shown that teachers of color also help close achievement gaps for these students. According to the Learning Policy Institute, teachers of color boost the academic performance of students of color, including improved reading and math test scores, improved graduation rates, and increases in aspirations to attend college. A study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that the Black students who were exposed to Black teachers by third grade were 13% more likely to enroll in college, and if they had 2 Black teachers by third grade, the likelihood of college enrollment jumped to 32%. One way to continue these efforts is to publicly and financially support grassroots organizations, such as the Center for Black Educator Development, in order to amplify their voices and efforts. This organization specifically is promoting continued education for Black teachers and advocating for public policy changes to help strengthen equity in recruiting, training, hiring, and retention of diverse educators. Other concrete ways we can promote diversifying faculties at schools in low-income areas are incentive programs like Grow Your Own Teacher recruiting, where community members are encouraged to enter the teaching force and high schoolers can be introduced to the field. This kind of program already exists in most states, but not all have direct state funding for the development of these programs. In addition to incentivize teachers to work in schools with a lot of minority students, we can create loan forgiveness programs and other benefits for teachers willing to work in these areas.
The second recommendation looks outside the classroom to what can be done to address income inequality and historical disadvantages, and suggests the implementation of baby bonds. At the surface level, this recommendation would address generational wealth gaps. A baby bond is a solution proposed by Derek Hamilton, a leading economist and scholar on the causes, consequences, and remedies of racial and ethnic inequality in the education systems. his experiences as a Black man from a working-class family who struggled to pay for education inspired his work to provide a better financial solution than he had growing up. Baby bonds would mean that when a child covered by Medicare or another government program that supports their family's wealth is born, they would receive a trust-like fund. To give you a sense for what this might look like, U.S. Senator Cory Booker proposed an initial amount of $1,000 provided from the U.S. Treasury, with additional deposits of up to $2,000 each year depending on the family's income. The bond would be accessible when the child turns 18 and can be used for anything from college funds, retirement savings, entrepreneurship startup costs, to investing in a home or real estate. While it may vary on a state-to-state basis, Booker's proposal suggests that the funding come from raising estate taxes and closing the capital gains loophole that allows wealthy people to avoid paying income tax on their capital gains. If people have access to wealth at this influential stage in their life, they have more flexibility and the opportunity to build a life as they would like and make plans for their future. The graph on the screen specifically shows how baby bonds could help close the drastic wealth gap between Black and white young adults. While we acknowledge that this recommendation does not pertain specifically to a classroom setting, it is important to recognize how the structures of wealth inequality harm kids before they enter the school system. This solution could help provide long-term equitable access to educational opportunities by narrowing the wealth gap between racial groups and high and low income groups. By attempting to uproot cycles of wealth inequality, baby bonds could also reduce residential segregation. This could hopefully address the issue of low amounts of property tax funding for schools in low-income areas. This solution, baby bonds, has been enacted in Connecticut and Washington, D.C., and 6 other states have concrete proposals for the future. This growth is promising in showing that baby bonds are a feasible recommendation with the future ahead of them.
We wanted to examine these possible solutions within the framework of utilitarianism that aims to maximize utility. When we look at Recommendation 1 in the hiring of diverse faculty, some may argue that teaching jobs should be hired blindly, focusing only on qualifications and experience. However, research shows that hiring teachers of color improves learning and outcomes for diverse students, as well as providing equitable career opportunities for teachers from historically disadvantaged groups. The long-term impact these teachers can make on students is valuable enough to prioritize representation in the hiring process. We wanted to implement this solution to help promote the recruitment, development, and retention of diverse faculty, rather than suggesting more complex policies like hiring quotas or direct affirmative action programs. The encouragement of diverse faculty would greatly increase the short-term and long-term utility for both minority students and the diverse faculty themselves, more so than any reduction of utility for the people benefiting from the current systems.
When using an ethical approach to analyze the second solution, it's important to consider that the taxpayers whose dollars would be redirected to the baby bond program would not lose as much utility as the children who receive them would gain from this investment in their future. The taxpayers who would be impacted by the estate tax and capital gains taxes are often far more well off and have more financial flexibility than the children enrolled in the governmental aid programs. Critics may say that baby bonds would be an unearned handout. However, the baby bonds would most benefit those who, often by no fault of their own, end up in low-income families and unjust circumstances. This solution seeks to address the harmful structures of income inequality and how that often leads to gaps in educational opportunity. The current policies and structures in place may benefit some, but the benefits from solutions proposed would outweigh the costs to the privileged. We know these solutions can't fix everything and don't tackle every issue we mentioned, but we decided to look at ones we believe to be the most practically effective, politically feasible, and morally permissible.